The night air hung thick with smoke and desperation as Margarete Hoffmann pressed herself against the cold brick wall of what remained of her family's apartment building in Frankfurt. It was May 1945, and the sound of American army trucks rumbling through the shattered streets had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She clutched the photograph of her dead husband, Klaus, his Wehrmacht uniform crisp and proud in the picture taken 3 years earlier, before Stalingrad had swallowed him whole, along with hundreds of thousands of other German soldiers. She was 23 years old, starving, and completely alone in a world that had been bombed into unrecognizable rubble. Her mother had died in an air raid 6 months ago. Her father had simply disappeared. Whether dead, captured, or fled, she would never know. The apartment above hers housed Frau Weber and her 2 skeletal children, surviving on a diet of potato peels and hope. Below lived old Herr Schmidt, who had lost his mind along with his 3 sons to the war. And now, in the courtyard below, she could see him, the American soldier who had been watching her for 3 days. He was tall, with dark hair, and a face that seemed too young for the sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. Unlike the other GIs who catcalled and propositioned German women with crude gestures and offers of chocolate, this one simply watched with eyes that held something Margarete hadn't seen in years: genuine human interest, not predatory hunger. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a sensation so constant she barely noticed it anymore. The official ration in the American zone provided barely 1,200 calories per day, not enough to sustain life, let alone rebuild it. Around her neck hung her grandmother's gold locket, the last valuable thing she owned, and she had already decided she would trade it tomorrow for flour on the black market, if she could find anyone willing to trade. The American soldier moved now, walking toward her building with purposeful steps. Margarete's breath caught. She had sworn she would never be one of those women, the Veronika Dunkeschens and Ami-Liebchen, who sold themselves for cigarettes and canned meat, who fraternized with the enemy occupiers while their own men rotted in POW camps, were laid dead in mass graves across Europe. She was better than that. She was a German woman, wife of a hero, daughter of a proud family. But pride, she had learned, made a poor meal. The soldier stopped at the base of her stairwell and looked up. Even from this distance, Margarete could see his face clearly in the spring moonlight. He held up something, a paper bag. Then he simply set it down on the bottom step and walked away, his boots echoing on the broken pavement. Margarete waited 5 full minutes, her body trembling with a mixture of fear, shame, and desperate hope. Finally, she descended the stairs like a ghost, snatched the bag, and fled back to her room. Inside, she found 2 tins of Spam, a loaf of white bread, real butter, and a chocolate bar. Also a note in careful schoolboy German: "You look hungry. I'm not asking for anything. Sergeant David Miller, Brooklyn, New York." She ate half the bread that night, crying as she chewed, each bite a betrayal of everything she had promised herself. But with each swallow, she felt her body awakening from its slow march toward death. And she knew, with a certainty that made her hate herself, that this was only the beginning of a story that would define her life and the lives of 90,000 other German women who would soon carry American babies in a land that had learned to call Americans both liberators and conquerors. The Germany of 1945 was not merely defeated, it was obliterated. As American forces swept through the western regions in those final chaotic months of the war, they encountered a civilization that had effectively ceased to exist. Major cities like Frankfurt, Munich, Cologne, and Hamburg existed as vast fields of rubble where human beings picked through the wreckage like ants navigating a destroyed colony. The statistics, when later compiled, would prove almost incomprehensible. 70% of housing in major urban centers destroyed or severely damaged, infrastructure decimated, and a population caught between the twin horrors of what they had helped perpetrate and what had been visited upon them in return. For the women of Germany, the situation was particularly desperate. The mathematics of death had created a society grotesquely skewed toward the female. Of the German men who survived the war, millions languished in Allied prisoner-of-war camps, their return uncertain and delayed. Millions more lay dead in the frozen fields of Russia, the deserts of North Africa, the forests of France, or buried beneath the rubble of their own bombed cities. What remained was a nation of women, children, and elderly men trying to navigate a landscape of moral and physical destruction. In Frankfurt, Margarete Hoffmann's story was neither unique nor particularly tragic by the standards of the time. Hundreds of thousands of women faced similar circumstances: young widows, orphans, refugees from the Eastern Territories fleeing the advancing Red Army. The difference lay in what happened next, in the choices that desperation forced upon them, and the unexpected connections that sometimes emerged from the ruins. 3 days after receiving that first bag of food, Margarete encountered Sergeant David Miller again. She had been standing in a ration line for 4 hours, waiting for her weekly allocation of bread and potatoes, when she felt someone watching her. She turned to find them standing a respectful distance away, hands in his pockets, looking oddly out of place among the Germans despite his military authority. He approached slowly, giving her time to flee if she wanted. "I hoped the food helped," he said, in his careful, accented German. "My mother would kill me if she knew I let someone go hungry when I could help." Margarete's first instinct was to snap at him, to reject his charity with the ice-cold dignity that had sustained her through 2 years of widowhood. But the words died in her throat as she really looked at him for the first time. He couldn't have been more than 25, with a face that seemed built for smiling, even though his eyes held the same war weariness she saw in every mirror. There was no trace of the conquering arrogance she had expected, no predatory gleam. Just a tired young man trying inexplicably to be kind. "Your German is good," she found herself saying, immediately feeling foolish for such an innocuous observation. His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "My grandparents came from Bavaria. I grew up speaking German at home. My mother insisted." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I'm not trying to... I don't want you to think I'm expecting anything. Everyone here looks so hungry, and you especially looked like you needed help." The ration line moved forward, shuffling another few feet toward the distribution point. They walked together in awkward silence. Finally, Margarete asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why me? There are thousands of hungry women in this city." David's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. "You reminded me of my sister. She has that same look you had, like you were holding yourself together through sheer force of will, but barely." He pulled out a battered photograph from his pocket, showing a dark-haired young woman with a determined jawline. "Rachel. She's a nurse back home. She has that same way of standing, like she's ready to fight the world even when she's exhausted." Something in Margarete's chest cracked at this unexpected vulnerability. This American soldier wasn't seeing her as a conquest or a commodity. He was seeing her as a human being who reminded him of someone he loved. It was such a foreign concept after years of being reduced to roles: dutiful wife, proud German, enemy, victim, survivor. "I had a sister too," she heard herself say. "Anna. She was 19 when the bombs hit." They reached the front of the line, and Margarete received her rations, a small loaf of gray bread and 2 pounds of potatoes. David watched as the official handed over the meager allocation, his jaw tightening. Without a word, he produced a requisition form and added 2 tins of condensed milk and a package of dried beans to her haul, using his military authority to supplement what the official channels provided. The older German man behind the counter glared at both of them with obvious contempt, but said nothing. Margarete felt shame burn through her veins, even as gratitude warred with it. She was accepting help from an American, from a former enemy, from a man she didn't know.
But she was also not starving for the first time in months.
As they walked away from the distribution point, David spoke quietly. I know this is complicated. I know your people and mine just spent 6 years trying to kill each other, but the war is over and people are still hungry, and I can't just watch that happen. He stopped, turning to face her directly. I'm not asking you to forget what happened or to pretend everything is fine. I'm trying to help. Is that okay? Marguerite looked into his earnest face and made a decision that would alter the course of her life. My name is Margarete Hoffmann, she said formally, and I appreciate your help, Sergeant Miller. He smiled, a transformation that made him look barely older than a boy. David. My friends call me David. I'm not sure we're friends, Marguerite replied, but there was no hostility in her voice. Not yet, David agreed, but maybe someday. As Marguerite walked home with her unexpected bounty, she was acutely aware of the stares from other Germans on the street. Some looked at her with envy, others with disgust. An elderly woman in widow's black actually spat at her feet. Marguerite kept her head high, but the shame followed her like a shadow. Back in her apartment, she laid out her rations on the small table that had survived the bombing. The condensed milk alone represented a luxury she hadn't experienced in years. She could make it last 2 weeks if she was careful, adding small amounts to the terrible ersatz coffee that passed for a hot beverage. The beans could make several meals of soup if she stretched them with water and herbs. She was still sitting there, staring at the food, when Frau Weber knocked tentatively on her door. The older woman looked gaunt, her eyes sunken deep in her skull. I saw you come home. I saw you with the American. Marguerite braced herself for condemnation, but Frau Weber's next words surprised her. My children are starving, the woman whispered. Little Hans can barely walk anymore. If you have anything you could spare, anything at all, I can pay you back when Friederike comes home from the camp. Looking at Frau Weber's desperate face, Marguerite made another decision. She divided 1 tin of milk and gave it to her neighbor, along with half the beans. For the children, she said firmly. And don't talk about paying me back, just keep them alive. Frau Weber clutched the offerings to her chest, tears streaming down her face. God bless you, Marguerite. God bless you. She paused at the door. And the American, if he's helping, if he's kind, maybe that's not such a terrible thing. Maybe it's just a human thing. After her neighbor left, Marguerite opened the chocolate bar David had included in that first package 3 days ago. She'd been saving it, uncertain why. Now she broke off a single square and let it melt slowly on her tongue, the rich sweetness almost painful after so long without sugar. And for the first time since Klaus's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. Sergeant David Miller had come to Germany expecting to hate it. His parents had fled Bavaria in 1938. Reading the writing on the wall before Kristallnacht made it unmistakably clear what was coming. His mother's brother had stayed behind, insisting it would blow over. The Germans were civilized people who wouldn't truly embrace Hitler's madness. Uncle Jakob had died in Dachau in 1941, shot while trying to protect his wife from SA thugs who dragged her away to be sterilized as racially undesirable. David had grown up in a household that spoke German at home, but was fiercely, defiantly American everywhere else. His father had anglicized their name from Mueller to Miller and had volunteered for the army the day after Pearl Harbor, despite being 43 years old. They had rejected him for his age, so it had fallen to David to carry the family's determination to help destroy the regime that had murdered their relatives. He had landed at Normandy on D-Day +7, part of the endless stream of reinforcements feeding the meat grinder of the European campaign. He had fought through France, crossed the Rhine, and entered Germany, expecting to find a nation of monsters. Instead, he had found ruins populated by ghosts who looked remarkably human in their suffering. The cognitive dissonance had to be staggering. These were the people who had cheered for Hitler, who had marched in goose-step parades, who had turned in their Jewish neighbors and watched the smoke rise from concentration camp chimneys. Yet here they were, starving and broken.
the elderly and women and children left behind to face the consequences of their leaders' apocalyptic ambitions. How was he supposed to reconcile his righteous hatred with the very real, very human suffering in front of him? His commanding officer, Captain Morrison, had a simple philosophy. Not our problem, Miller. They started this war, they deserve everything they got and then some. Feed them just enough to keep them from rioting, but don't waste sympathy on Nazis. But David had found it impossible to sustain that cold certainty when confronted with actual individuals rather than abstract enemies. The old man who had shown him a photograph of 3 dead sons while begging for cigarettes to trade for bread. The little girl with the hollow eyes who had watched American convoys pass with an expression of such hopelessness that it haunted his dreams. And Margarete, standing in the ruins like a statue of defiance, refusing to crumble even as the world around her had collapsed.
He knew he was breaking fraternization rules. The non-fraternization policy was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of personal connection between occupiers and occupied. American soldiers were not supposed to consort with German civilians beyond what was strictly necessary. But the rules had begun to relax in recent weeks as the practical impossibility of maintaining such separation became clear. And David had never been particularly good at following rules he found morally objectionable. His friend Corporal Jimmy Henderson ribbed him mercilessly about his charity cases. Jimmy was from Alabama, had never met a Jew before David, and thought the whole war had been a mistake that America should have stayed out of. "You feedin' more Fraulines?" he would ask with a knowing leer. "Or is this one special? She pretty enough to make it worth the trouble?" David had punched Jimmy for that, earning himself a 3-day assignment to latrine duty. But Captain Morrison had pulled him aside afterward and surprised him. "I get it, Miller, I do. You want to help, you think you can save 'em all. But you can't. This isn't our country to fix, and these aren't our people to save. We won our war. Now we let them figure out how to live with losing theirs." "But they're starving, sir." "They starved plenty of other people first," Morrison had replied, his voice hard. "I saw Bergen-Belsen, Miller. I saw what they did, so forgive me if I'm not breaking my heart over their suffering." David had no response to that. He had seen the newsreels of the concentration camps, had heard the stories from Jewish refugees who had survived. His own family had been murdered by this regime. How could he justify helping Germans when his own blood cried out for revenge? Yet, here he was, 3 days later, waiting outside Margarete's building with another bag of supplies. This time he had included soap, real soap, not the ersatz lime mixture Germans were making from God knows what. Also cigarettes, which were better than currency in the chaos of post-war Germany, and a jar of honey he had acquired from a farmer in exchange for fixing the man's tractor. Margarete appeared in her doorway right on schedule, as if she had been watching for him. She looked better than she had a week ago, some color returning to her cheeks. She descended the stairs with that same careful dignity, as if she were walking into a formal reception rather than accepting charity from a foreign soldier. "You came back," she said, and he couldn't quite read her tone. Surprise? Pleasure? Resignation? "I said I would," David replied. He handed her the bag, noticing how her eyes widened at the soap. "I thought you might need this. And the cigarettes. You can trade them for other things you need. They're worth more than money right now." "Why?" Margarete asked, the question bursting from her like it had been building for days. "Why are you doing this?" David had thought about this question constantly, examining his own motivations with the skepticism of someone who understood that even good intentions could mask darker impulses. "Honestly, I'm not completely sure. Maybe I'm trying to prove I'm different from the occupation forces I saw in France, the ones who treated civilians like dirt. Maybe I'm trying to make sense of how we're supposed to move forward from all this hatred. Or maybe..." He paused, searching for honesty. "Maybe I'm just trying to do something good in a world that's been overwhelmingly terrible for too long." Margarete considered this, her dark eyes searching his face. "I was taught to hate you. I mean, Americans.
The propaganda told us you were coming to destroy everything German, to rape and pillage and turn us into slaves. Some of that happened, especially with the Russians in the East, but you're not like what they said. I was taught to hate you too. I mean, Germans. Nazis who wanted to take over the world and murder everyone who didn't fit their perfect Aryan image. And a lot of that was true. More true than I wanted to believe. But you're not what I expected either. They stood in the ruins of Frankfurt, former enemies, finding unexpected common ground in their mutual humanity. Finally, Marguerite asked, "Would you like to come inside? I can make you coffee. It's not real coffee, just roasted acorns, but it's hot." This was a significant gesture, and both of them knew it. For Marguerite to invite an American soldier into her home was to cross a line that many Germans and Americans would condemn. For David to accept was to acknowledge that this had become something more than simple charity. "I would like that very much," he said carefully. Marguerite's apartment was a single room on the 3rd floor, sparsely furnished with damaged pieces that had been salvaged from the bombing. A narrow bed against one wall, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, a single hot plate for cooking, and a battered dresser with a cracked mirror. On the dresser sat a photograph of a man in Wehrmacht uniform, his arm around a younger, happier version of Marguerite. David looked at the photograph, and understanding crashed over him like a wave. "Your husband."
Klaus, Marguerite confirmed, her voice steady. "He died at Stalingrad, January 1943. I received the notice in March, along with his personal effects, a watch that had stopped working, a wedding ring, and the letter he wrote the day before he died." She paused, then added with brutal honesty, "He was a good man who fought for a terrible cause. I loved him, and I hate what he was part of. Both things are true." David nodded slowly, appreciating her refusal to simplify a complicated truth. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and meant it. War had stolen so much from so many people, turning young men into casualties and young women into widows, all in service of politicians' ambitions and ideologies' demands. Marguerite busied herself with the hot plate, boiling water for the ersatz coffee. When she handed him a chipped cup, their fingers brushed for a moment, and David felt an electric charge of connection that had nothing to do with charity or obligation. They were just two people who had survived a war they didn't start, trying to find their way in a world that had been fundamentally altered. "Tell me about Brooklyn," Marguerite said suddenly. "Tell me about a place the war didn't destroy." So David told her about growing up in a Jewish immigrant neighborhood where everyone spoke a polyglot mixture of English, Yiddish, and their native languages. He described the smell of his mother's brisket and latkes, the sound of the rabbi's voice during Friday night services, the way his father played chess in the park with other men who remembered Europe before it went mad. He painted a picture of a world where people from everywhere had come together to build something new, where being different wasn't a death sentence, but just another thread in a complex tapestry. Marguerite listened with the intensity of someone starving for hope, drinking in his words like they were water in a desert. And David realized that he wasn't just telling her about Brooklyn. He was showing her that rebuilding was possible, that there were places in the world where the war hadn't permanently destroyed everything, where life continued with some semblance of normality. "Do you think Germany can be like that?" Marguerite asked when he finished. "Can we become something other than ruins and guilt?" "I don't know," David answered honestly. "But I think you have to try. What's the alternative?" As the afternoon faded into evening, they talked about everything and nothing, about the strange new currency of cigarettes and chocolate bars, about the black market that had sprung up in every German city, about the refugees streaming in from the East with horror stories of Soviet occupation,
They carefully avoided the deeper questions about responsibility and complicity, about what Germans had known or suspected about the concentration camps, about how one rebuilt trust between peoples who had spent years trying to annihilate each other. When David finally left, promising to return in 2 days with more supplies, both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer simple charity. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected or particularly wanted, but which seemed to be developing its own inexorable momentum. As David walked back to the American barracks, he passed dozens of other GIs socializing with German women, some exchanges clearly transactional, others seemingly more genuine. The official non-fraternization policy had become a bad joke, impossible to enforce and increasingly irrelevant as American soldiers and German civilians were forced into daily contact. Some of these relationships were exploitative, built on desperation on one side and power on the other, but others he suspected might be something more complicated and potentially redemptive. He thought about Marguerite's face as she described her dead husband, the way she refused to either completely condemn or completely excuse. He thought about the photograph she kept prominently displayed, despite having every reason to hide it. And he thought about the fact that he, David Miller, son of Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution, was developing feelings for the widow of a Wehrmacht soldier who had fought for the Third Reich. The contradictions should have been impossible to reconcile. Yet somehow, in the ruins of Frankfurt, in the desperate aftermath of history's most destructive war, two people were finding a connection that transcended the categories of victor and vanquished, occupier and occupied. Whether that connection would lead to something beautiful, or simply add another layer of tragedy to an already tragic time, neither of them could yet know. As April became May, and May became June, the pattern of David's visits became routine. He would arrive at Marguerite's building every 2 or 3 days, always with supplies, always respectful of the invisible boundaries they had established. They talked for hours about their lives before the war, their families, their dreams that had been deferred or destroyed by history's demands. Carefully, they built a friendship on the foundation of shared humanity discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. Other relationships were developing throughout the American occupation zone, following similar patterns of necessity transforming into connection. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Millions of young German women with no prospects and no support, millions of young American men far from home and flush with resources. The official stance might condemn fraternization, but human nature proved stronger than policy. Some relationships were purely transactional: sex for food, companionship for cigarettes, temporary comfort for temporary security. But others, like the fragile connection growing between David and Marguerite, hinted at something more profound. These were the relationships that would eventually produce those 90,000 children, babies born from unions that defied easy categorization as either exploitation or romance, occupation or liberation.
Margarete's neighbor, Frau Weber, watched the developing relationship with mixed feelings. She was grateful for the food that sometimes found its way to her door, courtesy of David's generosity filtered through Margarete, but she was also troubled by what it represented. "Be careful," she warned Margarete one evening. "People are talking. They call women like you Ami-Liebchen, American sweethearts. They spit on you in the street." "Let them talk," Margarete replied, with more confidence than she felt. "I'm surviving. That's more than most can say." But the social consequences of fraternization were real and often brutal.
Women suspected of relationships with American soldiers faced ostracism from their communities, violence from returning German veterans, and rejection from families who saw them as traitors. In some towns, women had their heads shaved in public squares, marked as collaborators and prostitutes. Children born from these unions would face discrimination and questions about their legitimacy for years to come. Yet, the relationships continued and multiplied, driven by forces stronger than social disapproval or political policy. Loneliness, hunger, genuine attraction, the basic human need for connection, all of these factors pushed Americans and Germans together despite every reason they should have remained separate. David's unit was scheduled to remain in Frankfurt for at least another 6 months as part of the occupation force, but already there was talk of eventual demobilization and return to the States. The war in the Pacific had ended with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and America was eager to bring its soldiers home. Every time David visited, both he and Margarete were aware of the ticking clock, counting down to an inevitable separation. "What will you do when you go home?" Margarete asked one warm June evening, as they sat on the steps of her building, watching the sun set over the ruins of Frankfurt. David was quiet for a long moment. "I'm supposed to take over my father's hardware store in Brooklyn. It's what he's always wanted, what he built for me and my sister. But after everything I've seen, everything that's happened, I don't know if I can just go back to selling hammers and nails like none of this ever occurred." "But you will go back," Margarete stated rather than asked. "I have to," David said simply. "It's my home. My family is there. My whole life is there." The unspoken question hung between them. And what about us? What is this relationship that we've built, and does it have any future beyond these temporary circumstances? Margarete broke the silence with characteristic directness. "I don't expect anything from you, David. You've been kind to me when you didn't have to be, and I'm grateful for that. But I know this isn't permanent. I know you have a life waiting for you across the ocean." "But what if—" David started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the thought. "What if what?" Margarete prompted gently. "What if I don't want this to end?" David said in a rush. "What if I want to figure out how to make this work somehow?" Margarete looked at him with sad wisdom. "You don't want me, David. You want to believe that something good can come from all this destruction. You want to believe that Germans and Americans can move past the war and find something human to share. And maybe we can. But that doesn't change the reality that you have a home to return to and I have a country to help rebuild." "You're wrong," David insisted. "It's not about symbolism or politics. It's about you specifically. The way you refuse to let this broken world destroy your dignity, the way you share what little you have with your neighbors, the way you can hold two contradictory truths about your husband without flinching. I care about you." Margarete's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "And I care about you, more than I should, more than is smart or safe or sensible, but caring doesn't change facts." They sat in silence as the sun completed its descent, darkness slowly claiming the ruined cityscape. Finally, Margarete spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Klaus used to tell me that war reveals who people really are. He said you can know someone for years, but you don't really know them until you see how they act when everything is falling apart." She turned to look directly at David. "You've shown me who you are in the worst circumstances imaginable, and I wish, God, how I wish that we had met in a different time, in a different world, where we could have built something real." David took her hand, and for the first time since they had met, the touch felt less like comfort and more like promise. "Maybe we still can. I don't know how, but maybe we can figure it out."
As June faded into July, their relationship deepened despite all the practical and moral complications. They were not lovers, not yet, but they were something more than friends. They existed in a liminal space between victor and vanquished, between past and future, between two worlds that history had set at odds, but which individual humans kept finding ways to bridge. And they were not alone. Throughout the American occupation zone, similar stories were unfolding in infinite variations. Some would end in heartbreak when the soldiers went home. Some would produce children who would grow up questioning their identities and their places in both German and American societies. And some, a precious few, would become the foundation for families that would span the Atlantic and demonstrate that even history's deepest wounds could, eventually, begin to heal. The first time David kissed Margarete, it was August 1945, and the world had just learned about the full scope of the Holocaust. The newsreels from the liberated concentration camps had been playing in American military theaters, mandatory viewing for all occupation forces. The stated purpose was to ensure that soldiers understood exactly what they had been fighting against, to steel their resolve against feeling sympathy for the defeated enemy. David had sat through the footage of Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and Dachau, walking skeletons in striped uniforms, piles of corpses, the systematic architecture of industrial murder. He had seen the ovens, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the warehouses full of human hair and gold teeth and children's shoes. And he had thought of Uncle Jakob, who had died in one of these places, reduced to ash and memory. Afterward, he had walked the streets of Frankfurt for hours, rage and grief warring inside him. These people, the Germans shuffling past him on the sidewalk, the ones he had been helping and befriending, had done this. Maybe not personally, maybe not directly, but collectively they were responsible. They had cheered Hitler, had voted for the Nazis, had turned their neighbors over to the SS, or at least had looked away when the cattle cars rolled past filled with human cargo destined for extermination. How could he reconcile the horror of the camps with the humanity he saw in Margarete? How could he hold both truths simultaneously, that Germans had perpetrated the worst atrocity in human history, and that individual Germans could still be worthy of compassion and connection? He found himself at Margarete's building without consciously deciding to go there, his feet carrying him to the one place that had become a refuge from the chaos of his thoughts. She opened the door, took one look at his face, and pulled him inside without a word. "You saw the newsreels," she said. It wasn't a question. "You knew," David replied, accusation sharp in his voice. "You had to have known what was happening." Margarete's face went pale, but she didn't look away. "We knew something. Rumors, stories that people dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. We were told the camps were work camps, that the Jews were being resettled in the East." She took a shaky breath. "But I think we chose not to know, not to ask questions that might have uncomfortable answers. I think we told ourselves lies because the truth was too horrible to face." "That's not good enough," David's voice broke. "People died, millions of people, and you're telling me you just chose not to notice?" "No," Margarete said, her own voice rising. "It's not good enough. Nothing is good enough. There is no excuse adequate for what happened. But I'm telling you the truth about how it was possible, how ordinary people became complicit in evil by choosing ignorance over knowledge, comfort over conscience." She moved to her dresser and pulled out a small wooden box, her hands trembling. Inside were letters, dozens of them tied with string. "These are from Klaus. He wrote me from the Eastern Front, from Russia. And in his letters he mentioned things, villages burned, partisan civilians executed, orders that troubled him but that he followed anyway. I read between the lines and understood that terrible things were happening, and I did nothing." Tears streamed down her face now, years of suppressed guilt finally breaking through. "I told myself he was just following orders, that he was a good man caught in a bad situation. I told myself the people he killed must have been enemies, must have deserved it somehow. And then he died, and I grieved for him, and I never let myself think too hard about what he might have done, what I was complicit in, by loving him and supporting him, and not demanding that he refuse immoral orders." She held the letters out to David, offering them like a penitent making confession. "So, yes, I knew. Not the details, not the full horror, but enough that I should have questioned, should have resisted, should have done something. And I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. David took the letters with shaking hands, but he didn't open them. Instead, he set them carefully on the table and looked at Margarete, really looked at her. He saw a woman who refused to hide behind comfortable lies, who acknowledged her complicity without excusing it, who carried the weight of her nation's sins without being crushed by them. "I came here tonight wanting to hate you," he said quietly. "Wanting to hate all Germans, to make it simple again. Enemy and victim, guilty and innocent, black and white." "Maybe you should hate me," Margarete replied. "Maybe that would be easier for both of us. But I don't." David moved closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't hate you. And that terrifies me because it feels like a betrayal of everyone who died, everyone who suffered. How can I care about you when your people murdered mine?" Margarete met his eyes, her own filled with anguish and something else, something that looked like hope despite everything. "I don't know, but maybe that's how we move forward, not by forgetting or forgiving too easily, but by recognizing that we are all human beings capable of both terrible evil and unexpected grace." In that moment, standing in her sparse apartment with the weight of history pressing down on both of them, David kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss or a romantic one. It was desperate and angry and sad, filled with all the confusion and pain and impossible hope that characterized their entire relationship. When they finally broke apart, both were crying. "This is insane. We shouldn't be doing this." "I know," Margarete agreed. "But we are." That kiss changed everything. They could no longer pretend their relationship was simple charity or innocent friendship. They had crossed a line into territory that was morally complex and socially dangerous for both of them. From that night forward, they were lovers in the fullest sense of the word, bound together not just by affection, but by a shared determination to prove that human connection could transcend even the deepest historical wounds. The consequences were immediate and harsh. When word spread through the neighborhood that Margarete was sleeping with an American and in a bombed-out city where privacy was nearly impossible, word spread quickly. The backlash was severe. Someone spray-painted "Ami-Liebchen," American whore, on the wall outside her building. Women who had previously been friendly crossed the street to avoid her. Old Herr Schmidt, who had lost his mind to grief, occasionally screamed obscenities at her from his window. But the most painful rejection came from Frau Weber. The older woman appeared at Margarete's door one evening, her face hard with righteousness. "I can't accept your help anymore," she said stiffly. "My husband will be released from the POW camp soon, and I won't have him return to find that I've been taking food from a woman who betrays her country by sleeping with the enemy." "My country lost a war it started," Margarete replied, her voice steady despite the hurt. "I'm not betraying anyone by trying to survive and perhaps find some happiness in the ruins." "Your husband died defending Germany," Frau Weber spat, "and you dishonor his memory by spreading your legs for an American." Margarete flinched, but didn't back down. "Klaus died defending a regime that murdered millions of innocent people. I loved him, but I will not worship at the altar of a cause that brought nothing but destruction. If that makes me a traitor, then I'm a traitor." After Frau Weber left, Margarete sat in her darkened apartment and wept. For Klaus, for the friendship she had lost, for the impossible situation she found herself in. When David arrived an hour later, she told him what had happened.
In October 1945, Margarete realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complicated mixture of joy, terror, and resignation. She knew what this meant, not just personally, but symbolically. She would become one of thousands of German women carrying American babies, living proof of the occupation's most intimate consequences. She told David on a cool autumn evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. She saw shock, then fear, then something that looked like wonder. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes, I'm about 6 weeks along." David sat down heavily, his hands shaking. "What do you want to do?" "I want to have this baby," Margarete said firmly. "But I need to know, what do you want?" David was quiet for a long time, wrestling with the implications. Finally, he spoke. "I want you to come home with me, to America. I want us to get married and raise this child together." Margarete's heart leaped and broke simultaneously. "David, your family will have to accept you. My mother will be angry at first. She'll see you as the enemy, as representative of the people who killed her brother, but she's also a decent person who will eventually recognize that you're not responsible for the Holocaust, that you're just a woman trying to survive in impossible circumstances. And she'll love her grandchild, no matter what." "And what about me?" Margarete asked. "Will she ever love me? Or will I always be the German woman who trapped her son?" "I don't know," admitted David, "but we'll figure it out together." Over the following weeks, David began the bureaucratic process of arranging their marriage and Margarete's immigration to America. It was not simple. The military had strict regulations about marriages between American servicemen and German women, designed to prevent hasty decisions driven by loneliness or desperation. They would need approval from David's commanding officer, who would investigate Margarete's background to ensure she hadn't been a Nazi Party member or collaborator. The investigation was humiliating. Margarete had to provide detailed accounts of her activities during the war years, her husband's service record, her family's political affiliations. They questioned her neighbors, her former employer, even the woman who ran the ration distribution center. The unspoken accusation hung over everything. What kind of German woman seduces an American soldier? Was she a spy? A gold digger? A whore looking for a ticket out of the ruins? In the end, they found nothing incriminating. Margarete had been politically uninvolved, had never joined the Nazi Party or any of its affiliated organizations. Her husband had been an ordinary soldier, not SS or Gestapo. She was cleared for marriage and immigration. But David's commanding officer, Captain Morrison, called him in for a private conversation. "Miller, I'm approving this marriage because you followed the proper procedures, and your girl checks out clean, but I'm going to speak frankly with you man to man." "Yes, sir." "You're making a mistake. Maybe not about the girl specifically, maybe she's exactly who she seems to be, but you're taking on a burden you don't have to carry. There are plenty of nice Jewish girls in Brooklyn who would be thrilled to marry you. Girls whose families didn't spend the last 6 years trying to exterminate your people. Why complicate your life like this?" David had thought about this question constantly since proposing to Margarete. "Because I love her, sir. And because I think the point of winning the war was to prove that our values, democracy, human rights, individual dignity, are better than their values of racial purity and ethnic hatred. If I walk away from Margarete because she was born German, then I'm accepting their logic that people should be judged by their ethnic identity rather than their individual character. And that means we learned nothing." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's either the most idealistic thing I've ever heard or the most naive. I hope for your sake it's idealism." He signed the approval papers. "Good luck, Miller. You're going to need it."
David and Margarete were married in a brief civil ceremony in November 1945, witnessed by 2 of David's army buddies, who regarded the whole affair with bemused tolerance. Margarete wore a simple blue dress that David had traded half a month's cigarette rations to obtain. There was no celebration, no reception, no joyful gathering of family and friends. Just two people making vows in a borrowed office, trying to build a future from the wreckage of the past. The morning they were to leave for America, Margarete walked through the ruins of Frankfurt one last time. She visited the crater where her family's original apartment building had stood before the bombing, running her hands over rubble that had once been her childhood home. She placed flowers on the mass grave where her mother was buried along with thousands of other air raid victims. She even walked past Klaus's mother's house, though she didn't knock on the door. Frau Hoffmann had disowned her when she learned of the pregnancy, calling her a disgrace to her son's memory. As she stood in the central square looking at the bombed-out cathedral that somehow still stood despite missing most of its roof, Margarete felt the full weight of what she was leaving behind. Not just a place, but an identity. She would never be fully German again. The act of marrying an American and moving to his country would mark her forever as someone who had chosen the other side. But she would also never be fully American. She would always carry the accent, the memories, the guilt of what her nation had done. Her child, growing inside her even now, would be suspended between two worlds, bearing both German and American heritage, neither completely one thing nor the other. It seemed fitting, somehow. Perhaps that in-between space, that refusal to accept easy categories of belonging, was where the future lay. David found her there, his duffel bag over his shoulder, ready for the journey home. "Are you okay?" he asked. "No," Margarete answered honestly, "but I will be." They boarded the military transport ship in Bremen, joining hundreds of other soldiers heading back to America. Margarete was only one of a dozen German women on the ship, war brides traveling to uncertain futures in a foreign land. The other women kept to themselves, perhaps ashamed, perhaps simply overwhelmed. Margarete understood. They were all making the same impossible gamble, trading the known misery of defeated Germany for the unknown challenges of America, where they would be marked forever as the enemy transformed into family. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks. Margarete spent most of it sick with morning sickness, watching the gray water roll past and trying to imagine the life waiting for her on the other shore. David stayed by her side, patient and gentle, describing Brooklyn and his family and the hardware store that he would work at. "They'll love you eventually," he kept saying, as much to convince himself as her. "My mother is tough, but she's fair. Once she sees that you make me happy, once she holds her grandchild, she'll come around." Margarete wanted to believe him, but she had learned that hope was a dangerous thing to invest in too heavily. They arrived in New York Harbor on a cold December morning, the Statue of Liberty emerging from the fog like a promise or a warning. Margarete stood at the railing, her small suitcase containing everything she owned in the world clutched in one hand and David's arm around her shoulders, and watched America reveal itself. The city was enormous and undamaged, so unlike the broken ruins of Europe that Margarete felt disoriented just looking at it. Buildings reached toward the sky with an arrogance that spoke of a nation that had won its war on other people's soil, that had been strengthened rather than destroyed by the conflict. For the first time, she understood the magnitude of the gulf between victor and vanquished, between those who had fought the war at home and those who had fought it abroad. David's family was waiting at the dock. Margarete spotted them immediately, an older couple standing stiffly apart from the joyful reunions happening around them, their faces a mixture of hope at seeing their son and apprehension at meeting his German wife. David's mother, Sarah, was a small woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Margarete with an expression that was not quite hostility, but certainly not welcome. David's father, Nathan, seemed more resigned than angry, as if he had already accepted what his wife was still fighting.
"Mama, Papa," David said, his voice nervous in a way Margarete had never heard before. "This is Margarete, my wife." Sarah said nothing for a long moment, simply staring at Margarete with an intensity that felt like judgment. Finally, she spoke in Yiddish. Words Margarete didn't understand but whose tone conveyed clear displeasure. David responded in English, firmly. "We're speaking English, Mama. Margarete is learning, and it's her language now too." "So now you bring home a German," Sarah said, switching to accented English. "After everything they did, after Jacob, after all of it, you bring home one of them?" I brought home my wife, who is carrying your grandchild, who had nothing to do with what happened to Uncle Jacob, who lost her own family to the war and is trying to build a new life." Nathan stepped forward, cutting off what looked like an escalating argument. "Enough. This is not the place." He turned to Margarete and offered his hand. "Welcome to America, Margarete. Welcome to our family, such as it is." Margarete took his hand, feeling tears prick her eyes at this small gesture of acceptance. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I know this is difficult. I promise I will try to be worthy of your son and your welcome." Sarah made a sound that might have been a scoff or a sob, then turned and walked toward the parking area without another word. Nathan sighed. "Give her time. She's not as hard as she seems. Just give her time." The Miller family lived in a modest apartment above the hardware store in a Jewish neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business. Margarete's arrival caused a minor scandal. The neighbors whispered when she passed. Children sometimes shouted "Nazi" after her. Old men who had lost relatives in the Holocaust glared at her with undisguised hatred. But there were also moments of unexpected kindness. Mrs. Rosenblum from the next building, who had survived Bergen-Belsen, surprised everyone by bringing Margarete a pot of chicken soup when she learned about the pregnancy. "A baby needs good food," she said gruffly. "Whatever sins you carry, the baby is innocent." Sarah remained cold and distant, speaking to Margarete only when necessary and never in German despite being fluent. She prepared separate meals for herself and Nathan, refusing to share the kosher kitchen with Margarete. She corrected Margarete's English with sharp criticism, pointing out every grammatical error and mispronounced word. But David had been right about one thing. Sarah was fundamentally decent beneath her anger. When Margarete went into labor in April 1946, Sarah stayed by her side through the entire ordeal, holding her hand and coaching her breathing, speaking German for the first time in Margarete's presence to offer comfort in the language of pain and birth. The baby was a boy. They named him Jakob Nathan Miller, Jakob for David's murdered uncle, Nathan for his father. As Sarah held her grandson for the first time, watching his tiny fingers curl around hers, something in her face shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of a willingness to move forward. "He looks like David did. Same nose, same chin." She looked up at Margarete, and for the first time her eyes held something other than judgment. "You will raise him to know what happened, to know the truth about the Holocaust and what your people did. He needs to understand where he comes from, both sides." "I will," Margarete promised. "He will know the truth, even the parts that bring me shame, especially those parts." Over the following months and years, the Miller family slowly, painfully, began to knit itself together. It was never easy. Sarah and Margarete would never have the warm relationship of mother-in-law and daughter-in-law shown in Hollywood movies. There were too many ghosts between them, too much unresolved trauma and grief. But they learned to coexist, bound together by love for David and little Jakob. They learned to navigate their complicated history, acknowledging the past without being imprisoned by it. They became a family, fractured and imperfect, but genuine.
Margarete and David's story was replicated with infinite variations throughout the American occupation zone in those chaotic post-war years. 90,000 children were born from unions between American servicemen and German women, each one representing a story of survival, necessity, love, exploitation, or some complicated mixture of all of these. Some of those children grew up never knowing their fathers, who returned to America and left their German families behind. Some were raised in America by parents who worked hard to bridge two cultures and two histories. Some struggled their entire lives with questions of identity and belonging, feeling neither German nor American, but something in between. The women who bore these children faced harsh judgment from both sides. Germans called them traitors and whores. Americans often saw them as gold diggers and opportunists, enemy women who had seduced their soldiers. The children themselves were sometimes called occupation babies and faced discrimination in both Germany and America. But these relationships, controversial and complicated as they were, also represented something important: a human-level reconciliation that preceded any political or diplomatic reconciliation. In the intimate spaces of kitchens and bedrooms and nurseries, ordinary Germans and Americans were learning to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of enemy nations. They were building bridges across the chasm that war had created, one difficult conversation and one shared meal at a time. Margarete lived until 2010, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall and Germany reunified, long enough to watch her son grow up and have children of his own, long enough to see the world transform from the ruins she had known into something that would have seemed impossible in 1945. She never forgot Klaus, keeping his photograph on her dresser until the end. But she also built a new life with David, one that honored the past while refusing to be limited by it. David died in 2008, having spent 50 years running the family hardware store and raising a family that bridged continents and cultures. His grandchildren, Jakob's children, carried both German and Jewish heritage, living proof that even the deepest wounds can, with time and effort and grace, begin to heal. Their story was never simple or purely romantic. It carried the weight of history, the burden of guilt and grief, the complications of power imbalances and desperate circumstances. But it was also genuinely human. Two people who found connection in the midst of chaos, who chose hope over hatred, who built something new from the wreckage of the old world. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of those 90,000 children born in the aftermath of World War II. They remind us that history is made not just by armies and politicians, but by ordinary people making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. They show us that reconciliation is possible, though never easy or complete. They demonstrate that human connection can transcend even the deepest divisions, not erasing the past or excusing the unforgivable, but creating space for a future that holds both memory and hope. In the end, Margarete and David's story is about the possibility of moving forward without forgetting where we've been. It's about acknowledging complicity without being destroyed by guilt. It's about finding love in the ruins and building something worth preserving from materials that seemed irreparably broken. It's about the complicated, messy, difficult work of being human in a world that so often seems designed to make us into enemies. And it's a story that needed to be told, for the 90,000 children who carried the weight of two worlds, for the women who made impossible choices, for the soldiers who saw humanity in the enemy, and for all of us who need to remember that reconciliation begins not with grand gestures, but with small acts of connection between individuals who refuse to let history have the final word.